I rushed to the hospital near midnight after my son-in-law called and said my daughter had fallen down the stairs. Minutes later, a doctor placed a medical file in my hands and quietly said, "Your daughter didn't fall. 36 injuries, some fresh, some months old." My legs nearly gave out. When I demanded justice, a detective only lowered his voice and said, "Their family controls this entire county. No one dares touch them." I closed the file, looked at my unconscious daughter, and made myself a promise. If the law couldn't make them pay, I would. The coffee had turned cold a good hour before, but I left it sitting on the table all the same. 5 years on, and I still hadn't broken that habit. Evelyn had always claimed the second cup. 31 years of mornings, 2 cups every single day without fail. Now I still brewed 2, drank mine alone, and set hers down in its usual spot on the kitchen table where it would cool slowly until a thin gray film crept across the surface. My daughter Nora brought it up once on one of her Sunday afternoon visits, her voice soft and careful. She said it was the most heartbreaking thing she had ever witnessed. "Welcome, and I'm glad you found your way here to calm family revenge." Before we go any further, I'd love to know, drop a quick comment and tell me what you're doing right now while you listen. Are you driving somewhere, cooking, resting after a long day? It means a lot to hear from you. A note on this story: some elements have been shaped for storytelling purposes, and any resemblance to specific real people or events is purely coincidental. What matters is the truth inside it. I told her it was just coffee. We both knew that wasn't true. It was the 11th of November, a Tuesday, and the rain had been coming down since late afternoon in those long, straight curtains that Georgia sends in autumn, as if the sky intends to scour the county bare. I was at the kitchen table with a case file from 1986, an old audit pulled from a box in the garage for no reason. I could put a name to just something to keep my hands occupied. Outside, the rain struck the kitchen window in waves. The oak tree in the backyard bowed and straightened. Bowed and straightened the way old things do when the weather turns serious. I was 60 years old, 4 years into retirement. 35 of those working years had been spent as a state auditor for Georgia, which meant 35 years sitting across from people who lied with their mouths while their numbers told the truth. I had a talent for reading numbers. I was considerably less gifted at most everything else. The phone rang at 11:14. I know the precise time because I glanced at the microwave clock the moment the sound cut through the kitchen, the way a sudden noise always makes you reach for something solid. 11:14. The rain, the cold coffee, the oak tree bending in the dark. The number on the screen was Colt's. I had never liked Colt Drennan. I want to be honest about that from the beginning, because what came later might make it seem as though dislike was the whole of it. And it wasn't. Nora loved him, or believed she did, and for 3 years, I had told myself that a father's instinct is not the same as evidence. I had told myself that the unease I felt watching him rest his hand on the small of my daughter's back at family dinners was nothing more than the ordinary jealousy of a man who had raised a child on his own and hadn't learned to share her. I had told myself a great many things. I picked up on the second ring. Gerald. His voice was flat. Not the flatness of a man in shock, the flatness of a man who had rehearsed what he meant to say and was now delivering it. Nora had an accident. "You should come to Macon Regional Medical Center." My grip on the phone tightened until my knuckles cracked one after another like small gunshots in the quiet kitchen. My chest drew inward the way it had on the morning Evelyn sat down at the breakfast table and said the light looked strange, that sudden, terrible knowing before the knowing is confirmed. "What kind of accident?" I said. My voice came out steadier than I had any right to. "She fell," Colt said. "She's going to be fine, but you should come." He hung up before I could put another question to him. I stood in the kitchen for 11 seconds. I counted them the way I had trained myself to count in moments that wanted me to run. 11 seconds of standing still, breathing, letting the first wave of fear break and pull back before I moved. Then I put on my coat, checked the lock on the back door twice the way I always do, took my keys, and walked out into the rain. The drive to Macon Regional Medical Center took 19 minutes on a dry night. I covered it in 14, and I remember almost none of it. I remember the windshield wipers keeping their beat, and I remember thinking of the morning I had brought Nora home from that same hospital 32 years before 6 pounds, 2 ounces wrapped in a white blanket. Her eyes pressed shut against the light. I remembered thinking she was the smallest thing I had ever been entrusted with, and that I hadn't the first idea how to keep something that small safe in a world designed to break things. I parked crooked in the visitor lot and left it that way. The emergency entrance at Macon Regional Medical Center had the smell all hospitals carry at night: antiseptic and warm plastic, and something beneath that has no proper name, but that your body recognizes instantly and reads as a warning. A nurse at the front desk was beginning to ask me something as I came through the sliding doors, water running off my coat onto the linoleum, and I spoke 3 words before she could finish. I'm her father. Something in how I said it made her stop. She lifted a phone, spoke quietly into it, then pointed me down the corridor without asking my name or insurance card or any of the usual bureaucratic friction hospitals use to slow a person down. I was grateful for that. I wasn't certain in that moment that I could have answered questions. The hallway was long and fluorescent and very white. A janitor worked a cart past me, its wheels squeaking on the floor. 2 residents in scrubs moved the other direction, talking low about someone's potassium levels. Ordinary Tuesday night business. The world carrying on as it does, indifferent to the private terror of any one man walking any one corridor. I was halfway down when a door opened to my left, and Dr. Ingrid Story stepped out. She was a compact woman in her mid-40s, dark hair drawn back with the particular stillness of someone who had delivered bad news for a living and understood that stillness was its own form of mercy. She was holding a large brown accordion folder, the kind that holds imaging films, and she was not smiling. She had the look of a person who had been waiting for me and had used that time to settle on exactly how she would say what needed saying. She studied me for a moment, the way a doctor does when they are gauging how much a person can absorb. And then she said in a voice that was deliberate and low, offering no false comfort at the edges, "Mr. Calloway, I need you to see something." My heart dropped clean through the floor of my chest. My throat seized so completely that I had to swallow twice before my voice would come. And when it did, it scraped against something raw on the way out. "Show me," I said. She led me past 3 closed doors and a nurse's station where someone murmured into a phone. Then she stopped outside a room with a glass panel set into the wall beside the door. She didn't open it right away. She turned to face me first, and I understood she was giving me a moment, one last moment, before the moment that would split my life into before and after. "Mr. Calloway," she said, "I want you to be prepared. What you're about to see is going to be very difficult." "I've seen difficult things," I told her. My voice was steadier than my legs. "I know," she said, "but this is your daughter." She opened the door. The room was cold and white and very quiet, except for the soft mechanical rhythm of the monitors. There was a figure in the bed, small beneath the blankets, wired and braced so thoroughly encased in the apparatus of serious injury that for 2 full seconds my eyes moved over the bed without settling anywhere, refusing the way eyes sometimes refuse things they already know to be true. Then they landed. My knees buckled. not as a figure of speech, literally physically buckled the way a structure gives when the load surpasses what it was built to bear. I caught myself on the door frame with both hands, fingers spread wide against the metal, and made a sound that rose from somewhere below my sternum and left my mouth as something I had no word for. Not a cry, not quite something older than either. The face in the bed was swollen along the left side, a deep, ugly yellow-green that spoke of bruising days old. There was a shaved patch on her scalp, with a line of small, dark stitches running through it. Both forearms were wrapped in white bandaging. Her right leg was elevated in a soft brace. A thin tube ran from her wrist to a bag of clear fluid on a chrome pole beside the bed. It was Nora. My Nora. The girl who used to perch on the kitchen counter eating cereal straight from the box while I went through audit reports at the table. The girl who had called me in tears at 2 o'clock in the morning during her first week of college because her roommate played music too loud and she didn't know how to ask her to stop. The girl who had held my hand at Evelyn's funeral and said, "Dad, I've got you," when it should have been the other way around. "Come in," Dr. Story said from behind me, her voice gentle. "Come in and sit down." I made myself release the doorframe. I made myself walk the 8 steps to the chair beside the bed. I sat down, reached out, and laid my hand over Nora's hand, so lightly, so carefully. Every nerve in my body was telling me she was breakable, that the wrong gesture could undo whatever was still holding her together. Warm skin, rising chest, a pulse under my fingers. Those were the things I anchored myself to. Dr. Story dragged a chair alongside mine and settled in across the bed. She opened the brown accordion folder, reached inside, and produced a stack of imaging films, broad, translucent sheets she raised one at a time toward the window light. "I'm going to take you through each of these," she said. "I need you to let me finish before you say anything. Can you manage that?" "Yes," I said. The word split on the way out the way dry timber splits when you force it. She tapped the first film. Nora's ribs. 2 healing fractures here and here. "These did not happen recently, Mr. Calloway. The calcification tells me they are 4 to 6 months old at minimum." Second film. Left forearm. A hairline fracture roughly 8 weeks healed, and this one she lifted. The third is the right forearm freshly broken, which lines up with whatever happened last night. My grip on Nora's hand tightened until my knuckles went white. "How many total?" I said. Dr. Story steadied herself with a breath. 36 separate injuries documented across different stages of healing. Broken bones bruising damage to soft tissue. A beat of silence. "Mr. Calloway, 17 years I've been doing this work. What I'm looking at has nothing to do with a staircase. This is a sustained pattern, deliberate, careful, carried out over time. The walls of the room seem to lean inward." I flattened my free hand against my thigh to keep it still. She fell. I said not because I believed it, but because those were the words Colt had handed me, and I needed to hold them up in the light of this room and see what they were worth. "No," Dr. Story said, and there was nothing soft about it. She did not fall. She put the films aside and went back into the folder. What came out next wasn't radiology. It was color photographs on clinical stock paper, the kind taken for medical record purposes. She arranged them on the tray where I could see them, and I sat looking without speaking. Nora's forearms unbandaged for the camera. What the photographs showed beneath the removed dressings hit me like a physical blow. I had to press a fist hard against my mouth to keep from making a sound. The marks weren't the scattered evidence of falls or collisions. They were circular, evenly placed. The spacing had a consistency that could only come from repetition, from someone taking their time, someone who had done this before and intended to do it again. "These burns," Dr. Story said, her voice dropping to something almost private, show a geometry that points to a heated object applied with controlled, deliberate force. The pattern of spacing tells us this occurred across multiple separate incidents. My eyes were hot. I was not going to break in front of her. That decision had been made somewhere in the parking lot, and I was gripping it the way you grip the only thing between you and going under. "Who was it that brought her in?" I said. My voice had flattened out into the register. I knew well the one I'd used for 35 years of audit interviews when the answer was already written in the ledger, and I was asking anyway, watching to see how a person chose to face the truth. Dr. Story held my gaze without wavering. "Her husband," she said. "He told the nurse at intake that Nora had gone down the cellar stairs." I studied my daughter's face. The swelling, the stitches, the measured, methodical evidence of what had been done to her arms over and over. I thought of Colt's voice on the phone, that smoothed-out flatness, the tone of a man who had gone through the lines in his head before he dialed. "Is she going to wake up?" "She has a mild concussion and some swelling," Dr. Story said. "We expect consciousness to return within 24 to 48 hours. The injuries are serious, but none of them are fatal." She tilted forward. "Mr. Calloway, I was obligated to file a report with Adult Protective Services. I've already filed it, but there's something you need to understand." She paused, glanced toward the door, then back. "There are forces in this county that..." She stopped herself again. "Say it," I told her. She held my eyes for a long moment. Her jaw was rigid. Behind it, something turning that was equal parts fear and cold anger. "Be careful," she said at last. "Please, be very careful." I sat with Nora for 20 minutes after Dr. Story left. I held my daughter's hand and spoke to her the way you speak to someone who is beyond hearing. Low and steady. Things I should have said before, and things that didn't need saying but had to be said regardless. "I'm here. You're going to be all right." I told her that her mother would have had the right words for this moment, and that I was working with what I had. My voice gave out twice. Both times I let it, then drew it back, because Nora would need to find me upright when she opened her eyes, and that meant I needed to rehearse being upright, starting now. A nurse materialized in the doorway at some point, and said gently that the family was waiting for me out front. The word family landed just below my ribs like a stone. I pressed my lips to Nora's forehead, carefully searching out one of the few places that wasn't swollen or taped over, and stepped into the corridor. The family waiting area at Macon Regional Medical Center held plastic chairs and a wall-mounted television tuned silently to the Weather Channel. Colt Drennan occupied the seat nearest the door jacket, button-tie, unruffled thumb scrolling his phone screen, with a kind of unhurried ease while his wife lay 20 feet behind him. He had the look I thought of a traveler whose connecting flight had been delayed. Annoyed, not devastated. That is not how a man looks when his wife is 20 feet away, carrying 36 documented injuries and a row of stitches through her scalp. Over by the vending machines stood someone I didn't recognize, heavy-set mid-50s, a sport coat that owed nobody anything, the deep fatigue of a man well into a long shift that hadn't decided yet when it would release him. He held a paper coffee cup and wore an expression I had seen before. It was the expression of a man who already understood the shape of what was happening and was quietly calculating how much of that understanding he could afford to speak. Tucked into the far corner, partly obscured behind a rack of dog-eared magazines, was Reverend Vernon Ibarra. Tall 70s, close-cropped white hair, the kind of face built by decades of absorbing the grief of others and not flinching once. He had his eyes on me before I'd cleared the doorway. When they found mine, something passed across his features, recognition maybe, or sorrow, or the two wound together, and he moved to get up. Colt was on his feet first. Jur. He came across the room with his arm out, his face composed into concern so finely finished it could have been lacquered. Thank God you made it. It's been a terrible night. Nora is going to be fine. The doctors are saying good things. Sit down, Colt, I said. He went still, hands still out. A flicker behind the eyes. Not injury, not confusion, a rapid internal adjustment. The look of a chess player who has just watched a piece move somewhere it wasn't supposed to go. Gerald, I know you're shaken. Sit down, I said again. He sat. I turned toward the man at the vending machines. Law enforcement. The man drew himself up slightly and produced a badge. Detective Boyd Fenwick, Bibb County Sheriff's Department. Gravel and fatigue, that voice. Mr. Calloway, your daughter's case has been assigned to me. I'd like a word when you're ready. I'm ready, I said. Fenwick's eyes cut briefly toward Colt, then came back. Somewhere more private might be better. We moved into the hallway. Fenwick let the door settle closed behind him and took up a position against the wall, both hands wrapped around his coffee cup, like it was the one fixed point in the room. Standing closer, I could see he had more years on him than I'd registered at first. Not merely tired, worn down in the particular way of a man who has been hauling something heavy for years and has long since given up waiting for anyone to take the other end. Mr. Calloway, he said, his voice dropping to just above a murmur. I'm going to share something I probably have no business sharing, and I need you to take it in without doing anything reckless. I'm a retired state auditor, I said. Reckless isn't really in my repertoire. Something shifted across his face that might under other circumstances have been the start of a smile. It never arrived. Dr. Story filed the APS report tonight. I've gone through it. He paused. I've also gone through the other 4. My stomach dropped clean through the floor. The other 4, what reports? Fenwick said. 4 prior reports filed across the last 18 months. Complaints from neighbors. An ER visit 14 months ago entered into the record as a kitchen accident. A wellness check 6 months back, requested by a woman from your daughter's church. He dropped his eyes to his coffee cup. Every single one closed before it went anywhere. Insufficient evidence. A witness who walked back their statement. A referral swallowed somewhere in the system. He let out a slow breath through his nose. Mr. Calloway, I'm going to be straight with you because I believe you're owed that. The Thornton family Colt's father, Harwick Drennan, the county commissioner, has held that seat for 3 terms. He controls the pension fund for every officer in this department. Sitting judges show up at his Christmas party. I can write this up. I can push it up the chain, and it will die the same way the others died. And the only difference will be that they'll have your name on a list. My hands were knotted at my sides, arms trembling from the effort of holding everything in. The fury was immense, white, total, airless. Not the kind that erupts. The kind that simply expands, pressing outward until it occupies every corner of your chest and crowds out everything else. So what you're telling me, I said very quietly, is that this happened before that people were aware of it, and not one thing was done about it. That's what I'm telling you, Fenwick said. He had the decency to wear it on his face when he said it. Jaw set, eyes fixed somewhere near the floor between us. I'm sorry. I mean that. But if you go in loud and swinging and start making accusations in this county, you'll step straight into the narrative they've already built for you. Unstable father-in-law, contentious family, nothing to see. He raised his eyes at last. I can't be the help you actually need. I want you to know that I understand that, and I'm telling you this because he stopped, swallowed, because 4 reports got buried, and your daughter is lying in that room. I looked back through the glass panel in the waiting room door. Colt was back in his chair, phone out, thumb moving. Mr. Calloway Fenwick said, "Don't hand them anything they can use against you." "I won't," I said. I meant it. I had no intention of handing them anything whatsoever. Not a grievance, not a confrontation, not one loud, traceable, easily dismissed moment of anguish. I was not going to give them a single thing to work with. I pushed through the waiting room door. Colt glanced up from his screen. Reverend Ibarra was already on his feet, coming toward me from the corner. One hand extended, his mouth opening around words of comfort. I walked past both of them without breaking stride. Behind me, I heard Colt's voice, smooth, measured, pitched just a little too loud. "Gerald, I think there's been some confusion here. Nora is clumsy. You know how she is. Always has been. Why don't we sit?" I let the door fall shut between us. I sat in my car in the hospital parking lot for a long time before I turned the key. The rain had thinned to a fine mist, the kind that doesn't fall so much as simply exist in the air, settling over everything in a cold, weightless film. Through the windshield, the lights of Macon Regional Medical Center smeared and spread. I watched an ambulance roll in at the far end of the lot, its lights turning without any urgency the way they move, when whatever was acute is already resolved, and all that remains is the documentation. 4 reports buried. 18 months. My daughter had lived in that house for 3 years. I ran the numbers the way I always have, not by decision, just by reflex, the same way a carpenter can't look at a warped frame without calculating how far it's off true. 18 months of documented incidents meant the incidents themselves had started before that, which meant that when Nora had called me last Christmas and told me everything was fine, she had been lying to me, and I had allowed myself to accept the lie because I wanted to, because it was simpler, because I was 60 years old and already gutted by one loss, and I couldn't bear to look squarely at the possibility of another. I struck the steering wheel with the heel of my hand. Once. Hard. The horn let out a single startled bleat into the empty lot. Then I started the engine and drove home. The house was dark when I pulled into the driveway. I had left in too much of a hurry to flip the porch light on, and coming back to a dark house at midnight felt like a specific form of punishment I had earned. I sat in the car another minute, taking in the front door, the black windows, the oak tree in the side yard still shedding rain. Evelyn had put that tree in the ground the spring after we moved in. Nora had been 2 years old and had demanded a role in the planting, which had mostly meant coating herself in dirt and firing off questions. Evelyn had answered every one of them with full gravity, crouched down in the mud in her good jeans, explaining root systems and water tables to a 2-year-old who absorbed none of the content, but lived for the sound of her mother's voice. I went inside. The kitchen table still held the old audit file. The cold coffee was still there too. I stood in the doorway and took in the room, the chair where Evelyn used to sit, the 2 cups, the quiet, ordinary evidence of a life that had been coming apart in ways I had chosen not to examine. And a grief rose in me that was so complete and so furious, it very nearly took my legs out again. I said her name aloud into the empty kitchen. Evelyn, just that. Just her name. I don't know what I was expecting in return. The refrigerator ran its low hum. The faucet ticked once. The oak tree shifted in a small gust outside. She wasn't there. She hadn't been there for 5 years. But I could hear her all the same, the way I always could when things turned bad enough, her voice clear and dry with no tolerance whatsoever for self-pity. "Gerald, you don't fight fires with your fists. You find where they started." That had been her counsel on my 3rd week at the state auditor's office, when I'd come home seething about a county treasurer who was skimming infrastructure money and grinning at me across the conference table. I had wanted to go back in there and drive my fist through the drywall. Evelyn had been at this same kitchen table grading papers she taught 4th grade for 26 years. She'd looked up at me over her reading glasses and delivered it like it was self-evident, like it was the most obvious thing anyone had ever said. You don't fight fires with your fists. You find where they started. I had built a career on that sentence. I crossed to the kitchen counter and opened the cabinet above the refrigerator. Behind a box of old tax returns and a busted flashlight I'd been meaning to throw out for years, there was a cardboard box I hadn't touched since the day I retired. I lifted it down, set it on the table, and opened it. Inside, 4 legal pads still in their paper wrapper. A set of Dixon Oriole pencils sharpened, bundled with a binder clip. A Casio calculator from 1992 that still worked. The modest instruments of a working life. I took out one legal pad and laid it on the table. Pulled out a pencil. Sat down in my chair, not Evelyn's, and turned to the first page. At the top, I wrote one word. Drennan. Below it, the date. Below that, Macon Regional Medical Center Dr. Ingrid Story, 36, documented injuries, multiple healing stages. Below that, Detective Boyd Fenwick, 4 prior reports, all closed. Below that, Harwick Drennan, Bibb County Commissioner, 3 terms, controls pension fund and judiciary. I wrote for 45 minutes without stopping. Everything I had seen, everything Fenwick had told me, everything I had noted about Colt in that waiting room, the suit still buttoned, the tie still straight, the thumb working across the phone screen, while his wife lay 20 feet away. When I set the pencil down and looked at what I had, it was a beginning. Only a beginning, a first page, a roster of facts, nothing proven, nothing yet connected. But I had opened enough audits in my life to know they all looked exactly like this at the start. A page of names and numbers and question marks. What came next was always the same. You pulled the first thread slowly, and you let the fabric show you where it was ready to come apart. I reached into the bottom drawer of the kitchen desk, the one I almost never touched, and drew out a folded newspaper I had kept for 3 months without being able to say exactly why. I spread it beside the legal pad. The front page read, Harwick Drennan wins 3rd term as Bibb County Commissioner. There was a photograph of Drennan at a podium, one hand raised, working a crowd, with the grin of a man who had never once entered a room wondering whether he belonged there. Below the photograph, in a narrower column, ran a list of campaign contributors. I moved my finger down the list until I found it. 3rd line from the bottom, small print. Bibb Ridge Construction, LLC. I drew a slow, careful line beneath the name with my pencil. The same deliberate motion I had made 10,000 times across 35 years of audit work. Not in anger, not in haste, simply marking something that warranted a closer look. Then I called the hospital to check on Nora one last time before I tried to sleep. The overnight nurse said her vitals were stable and she was resting. Tell her I started and stopped, because there was no message that could be fitted into a phone call to someone who wasn't yet able to hear it. Tell her I called, I said. Of course, Mr. Calloway, the nurse said. Of course. I hung up. I looked at the name in the newspaper. I looked at the single word at the top of my legal pad. Then I switched off the kitchen light, left both cups on the table, 2 cups the way I always did, and went to bed. I did not sleep, but I lay in the dark, and I thought, and thinking for a man who knew how to do it was not so different from working. The call came at 7:43 the following morning, while I was on my 3rd coffee and my 2nd page of notes. Mr. Calloway. The voice was deep and unhurried, carrying the particular cadence of someone who had spent decades speaking to people in the worst hours of their lives. This is Reverend Vernon Ibarra. I was at the hospital last night. I don't believe we had the opportunity to speak. I remembered him, the tall man in the corner, white hair, watching me with an expression I hadn't been able to name. I remember you, I said. I have known about the Thornton family for a long time, Ibarra said. His voice dropped half a register. longer than I care to admit. There is a young woman you should speak with. Her name is Petra Lund. She worked for Colt Drennan until 14 months ago, when he dismissed her and did everything in his power to ensure she never worked in this county again. A pause. She has been waiting for someone to come along and ask the right questions. I believe you are that someone. My pen was already moving across the legal pad. Where do I find her? He gave me an address, a coffee shop on the east side of town, far enough from the courthouse square that it didn't draw the kind of clientele who reported conversations to people with offices in government buildings. Mr. Calloway Ibarra said before I could ring off. I have watched this family injure people for 11 years. I have prayed. I have counseled. I have sat beside people too frightened to speak above a whisper. His voice tightened, and for the first time the fury beneath the composure surfaced. I am very glad you came home. I was in my car 12 minutes later. Petra Lund was 28 years old and had the look of someone who had been through a fight she hadn't quite finished losing. She was at a corner table with a laptop open and a coffee going cold at her elbow, wearing a coat that was a size too large for her dark hair, pulled back with the no-nonsense efficiency of someone who had stopped caring about appearances around the same time everything else had come apart. When I came through the door, she looked up and took stock of me the way people measure a stranger they've been told to expect, cautious, watchful, not yet ready to extend trust. Mr. Calloway, she said. Not a question. Miss Lund. I settled in across from her and laid my legal pad on the table between us, open to the page with Drennan at the top. I watched her eyes move to it, and I watched something shift in her expression, a loosening like a door that has been bolted a long time, finally hearing the right key turn. Reverend Ibarra said you worked for the County Land Management Office, I said, under Colt Drennan. For 2 years, she said, jaw tightening, until I found something I wasn't supposed to find and made the mistake of saying so out loud. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and pressed until her knuckles went pale. He didn't just fire me, Mr. Calloway. He told the county HR office I had falsified data. He contacted the 3 other government offices I applied to and told them I had a performance problem. I haven't worked in my field in 14 months. Her voice broke on that last word, sharp, sudden, like something under pressure finally giving way. I have a master's degree in information systems. I'm 28 years old. I'm waitressing on weekends. The anger in her voice was clean and honest, the kind that is only produced by genuine injustice. It struck me somewhere I recognized. What did you find? I said. She turned the laptop to face me. The screen held a spreadsheet, columns of contract numbers, vendor names, award dates, dollar amounts, with a series of rows highlighted in yellow. Bibb Ridge Construction, she said, tapping the screen. They were awarded 14 of the 17 public land contracts issued over the last 2 years. Every one of them reviewed and approved by Colt Drennan. I flagged it because the bidding documentation was incomplete on 9 of those contracts. The required competitor bids were either absent or submitted by companies sharing a registered agent with Bibb Ridge. She met my eyes steadily. In information systems, we call that a pattern. In plain language, it means the competition was fabricated. My chest tightened. Bibb Ridge Construction. The same name I had drawn a line under in the newspaper at 2 a.m. When you flagged it, I said, "What happened?" Colt called me into his office and told me I had misread the data. Her eyes went hard. I hadn't misread a thing. I had a master's degree and 4 years of experience, and I knew exactly what I was looking at. She pulled the laptop back, dropped the lid halfway. He terminated me the next day and told me that if I said a word to anyone, he'd make certain I couldn't find work anywhere in the state of Georgia. Did he know you kept copies of the files? For the first time, something that was nearly a smile crossed her face, grim brief. He assumed I was too frightened to hold on to anything. He assumed wrong. She reached into her bag and placed a small external drive on the table between us. Everything I preserved before I walked out. All of it gathered in the normal course of my employment, legally properly, nothing he can contest. She slid it toward me. I've been holding on to this for 14 months, waiting for someone with the right background to know what to do with it. I picked up the drive and turned it over in my hand. Miss Lund, I said I spent 35 years as a state auditor. I know exactly what to do with it. I held her gaze. But you need to understand, this will get harder before it gets easier. She lifted her coffee, took a long, slow sip, and set it back down with the steadiness of someone who had already arrived at her decision a long time ago. Mr. Calloway, she said, it has been hard for 14 months. I am very ready for a different kind of hardship. The official documents came in 3 days after my meeting with Petra Lund. 3 days after I'd gone home and spent a long evening combing through her external drive, holding her records up against everything I'd already assembled. The morning after we met, I had submitted a formal written request under the Georgia Open Records Act, OCGA Section 50-1870, directed at the Bibb County Land Management Office. The right to demand public records from any government body belongs to every citizen. Contracts, bid, documentation, financial disbursements, the whole of it. All of it public. All of it legally owed within 3 business days. I had written enough of these requests over the years to draft one that gave a bureaucrat nowhere to hide and no grounds for delay. The response landed in my email at 9:17 a.m. on a Thursday, 41 pages, contracts, bid summaries, disbursement records. I printed the stack and covered my kitchen table with it. Petra showed up at 10, laptop under one arm, a box of her own files under the other, the records she had held onto from her years at the land management office. She stopped in the kitchen doorway and took in the table papers, overlapping papers, and her face did something complicated, grief and hunger running together, indistinguishable. "Okay," she said, and rolled up her sleeves. "Let's find it." 6 hours straight through. Petra navigated numbers differently than I did. She wasn't exactly reading them, she was listening the way a musician listens for the chord that's slightly off. Her laptop had her saved files open, and she was checking them against what the public records showed. I went through the contracts, the old way, pencil and paper margin notes, building up the page, and the familiar discipline of audit work came back to me, settled into my body, like a weight I'd been carrying so long I'd stopped feeling it. Then, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Petra made a short, sharp sound and spun the laptop to face me. "Look at this," she said. Her voice was pulled tight. Bid submission dates, 11 of the 14 Bibb Ridge construction contracts. Every competing bid had come in during the same 40-minute window. Same day timestamps bunched together. She pressed one finger hard against the screen. That's not what a real bidding process produces. That's what you get when someone coordinates 3 shell companies to file losing bids at the same moment, just to give the paperwork the appearance of competition. I moved in closer. She was right. Once you'd seen it, the pattern couldn't be unseen, the sort of thing that sits right on the surface of a routine document stack, hiding in full view, detectable only to someone who knows what honest bidding timelines actually look like. "Cross-reference the registered agents," I said. She was already there. Her fingers flew, bringing up the Georgia Secretary of State's Business Registry, a public database open to anyone who cared to look. 4 minutes later, "Bibb Ridge Construction," she said. "Registered agent Gideon D. Farnsworth. Next company up, Peach State Partners, LLC. Same registered agent. Gideon D. Farnsworth." She pulled the third Okmulgee development group. She went still. A slow breath. Gideon D. Farnsworth. Something settled over the room, a hush that felt almost physical. 3 companies listed as competitors. I said, all sharing one registered agent, all handing losses to Bib Ridge. I reached for my pencil. This isn't a bidding process. This is a performance. There's more. The quiet in Petra's voice was a different kind now, the quiet of someone bearing real weight. She turned the screen toward me again. I went through the contract approval signatures. Every Bib Ridge award, all 14 of them, carries the same authorizing signature. One person. She met my eyes. Colt Drennan. I wrote it down. I'd known somewhere in my gut that name was coming, but finding it on an official government document, his signature releasing millions toward a network his father controlled, made something in my jaw lock down until I could feel it all the way into my molars. And Nora. Petra said, picking her words with care, shows up in the public deed records. I lifted my eyes from the legal pad. She had a document on screen, a deed of trust filed 8 months ago, recorded with the Bibb County Recorder's Office. A public record like everything else. She zoomed into the signature block at the bottom, Nora Calloway Drennan, and next to it, a notarized date. I kept my eyes on my daughter's signature. Something was wrong with it. I knew Nora's handwriting the way you know a voice from birthday cards, going back decades from college essays I'd proofread from the little notes she used to stick to my refrigerator door. What was on that screen was cramped and unsteady, the letters pressing into each other the way letters do when the hand behind them is shaking. She put her house up as collateral. Petra said, her voice dropping. My 8 months back. The loan was drawn by a holding company with ties to Bib Ridge. A pause. Gerald, look at what she borrowed against. I looked. My stomach fell. She had no idea what she was putting her name to, I said. Not a question. No, Petra said. I don't believe she did. There was something in her eyes, not tears exactly, but near enough that the distinction barely mattered. And that's precisely why they needed her silent. I put the pencil down. Both palms flat on the table, I took one measured breath, the breath I'd trained myself to take during the worst moments of audits when the figures exposed something so catastrophically wrong that the mind needed a few seconds to absorb what the eyes had just confirmed. Then I picked the pencil back up. I need to make a call, I said. Clifford Odom answered on the second ring, same as always, as if he'd been positioned near the phone, and half expecting it, which with Clifford was genuinely plausible. Gerald Calloway, he said. No warmth in the greeting, not exactly more the sound of a man checking off a name from a mental roster he'd been maintaining, unsurprised to reach it. 3 years and 8 months, I said. A brief silence, and then with the particular tenderness of someone who shows care through exactness, you always did count things. Clifford Odom was 65, and he was built like a man whose biography came in 2 halves. His 20s spent doing things that didn't carry official titles, his 40s doing things that did. 22 years in the Army, the final 6 in units absent from any public org chart. After that, 18 years as a special investigator with the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. We'd first sat across from each other 30 years ago at a conference table in Atlanta, 2 young men working opposite sides of a tax fraud case, and held on to the friendship across the decades that followed, the kind built on total trust and infrequent contact. His house sat in a suburb east of Atlanta. Orderly to the point of austerity, nearly bare of anything decorative, the signature of someone shaped by years in operational settings. Nothing hung on the walls that would be hard to leave behind. Nothing tucked in a drawer without a clear function. I made the drive that evening. He opened the door, holding 2 mugs, pressed one into my hand before I'd spoken, and brought me straight to the kitchen table without any preamble. That was Clifford. He grasped instinctively that certain conversations don't benefit from warm-up. I told him everything. The 36 injuries. Detective Fenwick's admission about the 4 reports that never saw daylight. Harwick Drennan's stranglehold on the county courts and pension fund. Petra's findings on the Bibb Ridge contracts. Nora's trembling signature on a deed she'd been maneuvered into signing. Clifford listened the way he always did, absolutely still, his coffee sitting untouched. His gaze fixed on mine. No interruptions. No visible reaction. Just absorption, the practiced stillness of a man trained to hold emotion separate from analysis. When I got to the end, silence held for a moment. Then he lifted his coffee, drank slowly, and lowered it. "Okay. How far back does this go?" he asked. "Documented at least 18 months, I said. "Almost certainly longer." "And the county is rotten end-to-end, sheriff's department, the bench, the planning commission." I slid the legal pad across to him. "Detective Fenwick, the one who came to me, said 4 previous reports were killed before they went anywhere. Said that if I apply pressure through local channels, it dies the same way." Clifford pulled the legal pad toward him and read it the way he used to read a financial disclosure, unhurried, line by line, deliberate, lips barely moving. When he reached the final line, he tapped the bottom of the page with one finger. "You need to go federal," he said. "That's why I came." He settled back in the chair. He looked older than 65 just then. Not weakened, there was nothing weak about him, but burdened in the specific way of someone who has devoted a lifetime to understanding how completely institutions can betray the people who rely on them. His jaw was set. His eyes were steady and sharp. "Gerald," he said, "I'm still holding an active security clearance, and I have standing relationships with 3 people at the DOJ and 2 at FBI Atlanta. When I left the IRS, I held on to my federal whistleblower submission credentials. There's an encrypted direct submission channel through the DOJ Office of Inspector General that routes entirely around state and local handling. A package sent through that channel travels straight to Washington. It never touches an inbox, a desk, or a single set of hands anywhere in Georgia that Harwick Drennan has ever had occasion to reach. It arrives untouched. Something in my chest eased 1 degree no more. But it was the first easing I had felt in 4 days. "What do we need?" I said. "Everything you walked me through tonight, properly organized." Clifford ticked items off on his fingers. "The contracts and bid records from your open records request. Petra's analysis with her source documentation, the deed of trust carrying Nora's signature, Dr. Story's medical records, if she'll authorize release." He paused. "And something originating from inside the Drennan household itself. Something their own people put on paper. The cleanest evidence is always what the subject produced with their own hand." I turned over something Nora had mentioned on the phone 3 months back. A passing remark, the kind you tuck away without quite knowing why. She'd brought up a woman who worked inside the Drennan home, Lucia she'd called her, and she had said it quietly, nearly as an aside. "Dad, I think she's scared too. There may be someone," I said, "inside that house." Clifford set his coffee down with deliberate care and looked at me the way a man looks when he's running fresh calculations on risk. "If there's a source inside that house," he said, "getting them out safely comes before everything else. Everything else is secondary." "Agreed," I said. He stood crossed to the counter and returned with a small notepad of his own spiral-bound, the kind that slides into a shirt pocket. He uncapped a pen and sat back down. "All right," he said. "Tell me about this woman. Beyond the windows, The Atlanta suburbs lay quiet under a clear November sky. Inside, two old men with pencils and a combined 68 years of tracking money through dark corridors sat facing each other across a kitchen table and began carefully to build something. Dr. Ingrid Story's office was the last door at the far end of a corridor that carried the smell of floor cleaner and stale coffee. When I knocked at 5 on a Wednesday evening, she pulled the door open before my second knock had finished, as though she'd been standing just on the other side waiting. She looked different from the night she had walked me to Nora's room. The clinical composure was still in place, but something beneath it had shifted. Her eyes held the particular exhaustion of someone whose sleep had been poor for days. And the way she glanced down the hallway in both directions, before stepping back to let me in, told me exactly what the past week had taken from her. "I wondered when you'd come back," she said, closing the door and turning the small lock on the handle. "I've been expecting you." "Then you know why I'm here," I said. "I know what I did," she said, "and I know what I stand to lose by talking to you." She moved toward her desk but didn't sit. She stationed herself behind it the way people position themselves behind solid things when a hard conversation is coming. 3 days after I filed the APS report, the hospital administrator called me. He told me a complaint had been lodged against my license with the Georgia Medical Board. Anonymous, alleged clinical negligence. Her voice held steady, but her hands pressed flat on the desk were visibly shaking. "I have practiced medicine for 17 years, Mr. Calloway. Not one complaint, not once in my entire career." "Harwick Drennan," I said. "I can't prove it." She held my gaze directly. "But I know it. The way you come to know things in this county, not because anyone tells you, but because you understand how the machinery operates." She drew a breath. "He wanted me to amend Nora's records, change the documentation from a pattern injury assessment to accidental trauma. I was told not asked, told that if I cooperated, the complaint would be dropped." My jaw clamped so hard, a pulse of pain climbed toward my left ear. "Did you amend them?" "Yes," she said, and the word landed on her like a physical thing. Her shoulders dropped, her chin came up, the bearing of someone absorbing a blow they've been steeling themselves for. "I amended the official record. I had no choice, Mr. Calloway. My license isn't simply my livelihood. It is what keeps me at my patients' bedsides." Her eyes went bright with something between fury and anguish. "But I want you to understand what I did before I ever touched that file." She reached into her desk drawer and set a folded sheet of paper in front of me. "Before I made a single change," she said, her voice dropping to something measured and precise, "I submitted a full anonymous report to the Georgia Medical Board myself, original findings, imaging analysis, a complete timeline of events filed through the board's confidential reporting system. It now exists in their independent record entirely outside this hospital's system, entirely beyond anything Harwick Drennan can reach." She paused. "And the amended file, the one I was compelled to alter, I saved it through the hospital's document management system in a way that preserved the full modification history." I looked up from the paper. "Every change made to a digital medical record is logged automatically," she said. "Timestamp user ID, the IP address of the workstation that initiated the request." She held my eyes. "The request to amend Nora's file did not originate from my workstation, Mr. Calloway. It came from a computer registered to the office of the Bibb County Commissioner." The room went very quiet. Not the quiet of absence, the quiet of something vast settling into position. "You have documentation of this," I said. "I have a screenshot of the modification log taken before the system could be cleared." She opened her laptop and turned it toward me. "I also have the original imaging films locked in a safety deposit box at a bank in Savannah, 2 hours from here under my mother's maiden name." For the first time, something moved across her face that was close to fierce. I did not spend 17 years in medicine to let someone erase what was done to that young woman. I studied the modification log on the screen. The IP address, the timestamp, the user ID threading back to a government workstation that had no legitimate reason to exist anywhere near a patient's file. Dr. Story? I said, I need your authorization to include all of this in a federal evidence package. She closed the laptop and drew herself up behind her desk. For a moment, she looked precisely like what she was, a woman who was frightened and worn through and completely certain about what she intended to say. You have it, she said, every last piece of it. As I was leaving, she called from the doorway. Mr. Calloway. I turned. Her voice had gone soft again. Tell me when she wakes up, please. You'll be the second call I make, I said. Her chin trembled once briefly, then went still. Good, she said. Good. I tracked down Lucia Fuentes' number the way I tracked down most things, by being methodical. On my third visit to the hospital, I had asked the attending nurse about Nora's personal effects, the ordinary items a person carries that end up bagged and tagged when they're admitted unconscious. The nurse confirmed that Colt Drennan had never requested them. I signed for the bag without hesitation. I was her father. I was listed as emergency contact and Colt had made no claim. Nora's phone was inside, sealed in a plastic Ziploc, along with her rings, her watch, and a receipt from a gas station in Warner Robins. I went through her contacts that same evening, sitting in the hospital parking lot, under a light that buzzed and flickered overhead. Most of the names I recognized. Near the bottom, saved simply as Lucia F., was a number with a Georgia area code. Beside it, in Nora's handwriting, she had a habit of adding small notes to her contacts, were 4 words, "She's scared too, Dad." My throat closed so completely, I had to press my fist against my sternum and breathe through it. Nora had written that for me. Perhaps not deliberately, not in the sense of sitting down and thinking someday my father will need this, but some part of her had known the way people caught in dangerous circumstances develop a quiet, wordless instinct for leaving markers. I photographed the screen and sent it to Clifford that night. He rang back 14 minutes later. I'll reach out to her, he said. You stay away from her entirely. If the Drennans are watching you and they are watching you, your name anywhere near this woman puts her at risk. Understood, I said. Grr. His voice dropped. If she has what we think she has, getting her out safely is the whole game. Getting her out safely was the whole game. He was right. I knew it without question. The hardest thing I did over the next 3 days was the thing I had not done since I first opened that legal pad at the kitchen table. I waited. Clifford called on a Wednesday night at 11:47. She's in the car, he said. She's safe. We're across the county line. I sat down on the kitchen floor, not a chair, the floor, my back against the cabinet, because my legs simply refused to hold me any longer. I pressed the phone to my ear and listened to the sound of tires on pavement, and felt something that had been wound tight in my chest for days begin to give. Is she all right? I said. She's shaken. She's been carrying this alone for a long time. A pause. Gerald, she had the phone ready. She walked out of that house with it already in her coat pocket. She knew exactly what she was doing. Lucia Fuentes was 41 years old and had spent 6 years working inside the Drennan household. She was a slight woman with watchful eyes and the kind of stillness particular to someone who had learned very early that being noticed carried its own risks. When Clifford brought her to my house the following morning, a detour en route to Tennessee, where a women's advocacy organization he knew had agreed to take her in temporarily, she settled at my kitchen table with both hands cupped around a mug of tea and regarded me with the worn directness of a person who had finished being afraid. "Mrs. Fuentes," I said, "you don't have to tell me anything you're not ready to share." "I want to tell you," she said. Her accent was soft. Her English careful and deliberate, the English of someone who had worked hard to earn every word of it. "I have wanted to tell someone for a very long time." She looked down at her tea. "The first time Harwick Drennan raised his voice at me, I was so frightened I dropped an entire tray of dishes. That was 6 years ago." She looked back up. "I learned very quickly that in that house you do not make noise, you do not ask questions, and you do not let them catch you looking." "But you kept your phone," I said. Something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile, but near enough. "My daughter gave me that phone," she said. "She showed me how to use the voice recorder. She said, 'Mama, if anyone ever hurts you, you press this button.'" Her jaw tightened. I pressed it many times. She reached into her coat pocket and set a worn, flip-style smartphone on the table between us. The screen had a hairline crack running from one edge to the other. "Georgia law," Clifford said from the doorway where he was leaning with his arms folded, "is a one-party consent state, meaning a person can legally record any conversation they're participating in or present for." Every file on that phone had been captured while Lucia was in the room. He looked across at me. "It's clean, Gerald. Every bit of it." I picked the phone up carefully, the way you handle something that has been obtained at considerable cost. "May I said, glancing at Lucia. She gave a single firm nod. I opened the audio files. There were 37 of them, spanning 14 months, each one labeled with a date written in Lucia's hand on the case. I pressed play on the most recent. The sound quality was imperfect, the close, muffled capture of a phone recording from inside a coat pocket, but the voices came through clearly. A man's voice, low and authoritative, the voice of someone who had never once considered the possibility of being overheard. Then a woman's voice, clipped and certain. "Make sure the Callaway Woman's Foundation gets the transfer this week." Gideon confirmed the account. I stopped the recording. My hand was trembling. I set the phone on the table, pressed both palms flat against the wood, fixed my eyes on the surface, and breathed one breath, 2, 3, while those words arranged themselves into their full meaning inside my head. The Callaway Woman's Foundation. Evelyn's foundation. They had used her name. They had taken the small good thing my wife had built during her lifetime, the scholarship fund she had spent her last healthy years creating for fourth-grade teachers in low-income districts, and used it to move dirty money. "Gerald." Clifford's voice reached me from somewhere that felt very far away. He had crossed the room without my noticing, and his hand came down on my shoulder, heavy and steady. "Gerald, stay with me." "I'm here," I said. My voice came out wrong, flat, as though traveling the length of a long corridor. "Good." He gripped once. "Because we just found the federal hook." Lucia was watching me from the other side of the table, her eyes carrying grief and apology, in the same measure as if she were sorry to be the one who had to show me this. I looked at her and thought about what it had cost her to carry these recordings for 14 months, a cracked phone in a coat pocket, waiting for someone to come. "Mrs. Fuentes," I said, and my voice had found its footing again, the way it does when you make the decision that trades grief for purpose. "Thank you for every single one of these." Her eyes filled. She pressed her lips together and nodded, and that nod held everything that words were too small to carry. After Clifford drove Lucia to Tennessee, I sat at the kitchen table with her phone and my legal pad, and didn't move for a long time. Petra arrived at 9 o'clock. She came through the front door with her laptop bag on one shoulder and 2 coffees from the gas station on Highway 41, and she stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at me the way a person looks when they can see that something fundamental has changed in someone overnight. She set both coffees on the table without a word and sat down. "Tell me," she said. I played her the recording. When Nadine Drennan's voice filled the kitchen, "Make sure the Callaway Woman's Foundation gets the transfer this week." Petra's hand went to her mouth. Her eyes went wide and then immediately narrow the way eyes do when shock burns off and what's left is pure anger. "Evelyn Callaway Foundation," I said. "My wife built it in the last 3 years of her life. A scholarship fund for elementary school teachers in low-income districts. She raised $47,000 before she became too ill to go on." Petra lowered her hand from her mouth. Her jaw was set hard. "They used her name," she said, and there was a rawness in her voice that caught me, the genuine outrage of someone confronting a cruelty that exceeded even what they'd been prepared for. "Gerald, they used a dead woman's name to move dirty money." "Yes," I said. "They did." The fury was their enormous total, the kind that occupies every space inside you and leaves no room for anything else. I let it be there. I didn't push it down, and I didn't let it move me before I was ready. I picked up my pencil the way I had always picked it up when numbers showed me something that made me want to put my fist through a wall. "Pull the Form 990, I said. Petra was already opening her laptop. "Every nonprofit organization registered under Section 501c3 of the Internal Revenue Code is required to file a Form 990 annually, a public document freely accessible through the IRS database and third-party nonprofit transparency sites." The Evelyn Callaway Foundation had filed 3 of them. Petra had the most recent on screen in under 4 minutes. "Now here," she said, turning the laptop. "Financial statements, Schedule B donor contributions, Schedule I grants." She scrolled and stopped. "Gerald, look at this." A single line item in the contribution schedule dated 8 months ago. Amount $230,000. Donor listed as Ochmulgee Community Trust. My pencil stopped moving. $230,000 into a foundation that had raised $47,000 across 3 years into Evelyn's foundation. "Ochmulgee Community Trust," Petra said, already searching her fingers, moving fast. "Let me get the registration." 30 seconds. "Registered in Delaware." She paused. "Registered agent." She went still. Her face emptied. "Gideon D. Farnsworth. The same registered agent as Bibb Ridge Construction. The same name we had found on the shell companies filing phantom bids on Colt's land contracts. The pieces locked together with the particular finality of an audit that has found its center the moment when a scattered field of numbers resolves into a single coherent pattern, and you understand that what you have been staring at was never random at all. "It's the same network," I said. "It's all one network," Petra said. Her voice was low and tightly controlled. "Bibb Ridge, the shell company's Ochmulgee Community Trust. It's one system, Gerald. Harwick built one system and routed everything through it." I stood up from the table and walked to the window. The November yard was bare and gray outside, the oak stripped down to its bones, every branch exposed, nothing left to conceal the structure. I looked at it for a moment and thought about Evelyn planting it, crouched in the mud with 2-year-old Nora beside her, asking questions about root systems. Then I called Clifford. He picked up on the first ring. I gave him the number $230,000. Ochmulgee Community Trust. Gideon D. Farnsworth. The thread leading back to Bibb Ridge Construction. In a moment, I'll share what those next 3 days cost me and what came through on the other end of a late-night phone call that changed the weight of everything. But first, Let me ask you this, if the people closest to you had been quietly working against you all along, would you move the moment you knew? Or would you wait and let the truth do the work? 4 seconds of silence on the line. I counted every one. When Clifford spoke again, his voice had dropped into a different register, the one he used when a case crossed a threshold. Gerald, that level of money routed through a nonprofit via a Delaware trust, we're talking federal reporting triggers. A beat. Okmulgee Community Trust. He went quiet again. I need to make a call. 22 minutes. Then his voice came back, no greeting, nothing wasted. Okmulgee Community Trust is flagged on an active DEA watch list. They've had it cataloged as a financial vehicle tied to organized distribution networks across the Southeast. Passive monitoring 16 months running. Flat. Deliberate. Each word laid down like something with mass behind it. Gerald, the instant that transfer touched Evelyn's foundation, this case left the county behind entirely. We're not talking land fraud. We're not talking local graft. DEA, FBI, DOJ, all three have jurisdiction now. I pulled out the chair and sat back down. On the windowsill, Evelyn's photograph, the one from the spring we put the oak tree in the ground. Her face tilted toward something outside the frame, laughing, her hair pushed sideways by an April wind. I said it again, not to Petra, not to Clifford. Said it to the room, to her. They used her name. Yes, Clifford said, and his voice had gone very quiet. They did, and it's going to be the last serious error they commit. A pause. I'm reaching out to Brenda Alcott at FBI Atlanta tonight. But I want you to understand something. Gerald, once that call goes through, there's no slowing it down. It moves the way these things move. Are you ready? I looked at the legal pad in front of me. The name at the top, Drennan. 14 pages of documentation beneath it, every figure verified, every link traced, every thread run all the way to its end. Then I looked at Evelyn one more time. Make the call, I said. 4 days after Clifford contacted Brenda Alcott, I drove to the grocery store on Forsyth Street. Coffee, bread, a few other things I may or may not have actually needed. Mostly, I needed somewhere to put my body that wasn't the kitchen table. I was midway down the cereal aisle when I registered them. 2 men, one positioned near the far end of the aisle, turning over a box with the studied concentration of someone with no genuine interest in its contents. The second was directly behind me, near enough that I could pick up his breathing, both somewhere in their early 40s. Both dressed in clothing that wanted to read as casual and didn't quite get there, the kind of outfits chosen by people who need to look unremarkable and have thought too hard about it. 35 years spent decoding things engineered to resist being decoded. I recognized the act immediately. I kept the cart moving. No change in pace. No eye contact. I cleared the cereal section, moved into bread, added a whole wheat loaf to the cart, kept going toward the coffee shelves at the far end. They maintained their interval close enough to track me far enough to avoid drawing attention. When I reached the coffee display, the first man stepped in beside me. Broad through the shoulders, a face that time had rendered more imposing than handsome. He lifted a bag of coffee, held it without looking at it, and spoke just above a murmur. Mr. Calloway, Commissioner Drennan wanted you to know he holds you in high regard. He hopes you're looking after yourself. He returned the bag to the shelf and aligned it with the others, that small, precise adjustment, as if orderliness signified something. Then both men moved toward the front of the store and pushed out through the sliding doors, neither of them glancing back. I stayed where I was, both hands wrapped around the cart handle, my pulse hammering somewhere in my throat. Mouth dry. Something uncertain happening in my knees. I didn't move. I stood in that aisle and breathed slow and deliberate and waited for my heartbeat to come down, because a man broadcasting fear is a man who can be read, and I had no intention of being read on Forsyth Street while anyone might be watching. I bought the coffee, the bread. I drove home at the posted limit the entire way. At 8 that evening, my phone rang. Colt's number on the screen. I picked up. Dad. Warmth in his voice, but not the natural kind. Warmth that had been constructed, rehearsed, brought out for specific occasions. I've been thinking about you a lot. I know it's been a hard stretch. I want you to know I'm not going anywhere, and I'd like us to find a path forward together. My grip on the phone tightened. Outside the kitchen window, the oak tree was a dark shape against a darker sky. I think there's been some misunderstanding about what happened to Nora. His voice kept flattening out, the edges smoothed away the way you'd work a wrinkle out of something before wearing it somewhere it matters. She's always been prone to accidents, you know that as well as anyone. And I'm concerned that certain people around her at the hospital may have been planting things in her mind. Ideas that aren't doing her any good while she recovers. Ideas, I said. Yes. A pause opened up. He was listening hard, trying to calibrate how much I knew from the temperature of my response. I think we should sit down. Just the two of us. Talk like men who both care about this family. Colt, I said, I appreciate the call. A longer silence this time. I could feel him searching for a foothold and finding the surface smooth. Of course, he said finally. Family is everything. It is, I said. Good night, Colt. I ended the call. I sat with the phone on the table in front of me and thought about what had just happened. He had called to take a measurement and gone away with nothing to measure. No anger he could use, no accusation he could track, no fear leaking through. A worried man calls. A man watching his position erode calls. A man who believes he can still contain the damage calls and floats the idea of a meeting. I opened the legal pad and wrote Colt called. Warm, deliberate proposed meeting, assessing threat level, unaware of what we hold. Then I dialed Clifford. 2 men showed up at the grocery store today, I said. And Colt phoned this evening. He was angling for a face-to-face. Clifford let out a slow breath. They're rattled. That's useful. Gerald rattled people cut corners. A pause. How are you doing, honestly? The question caught me off guard enough that I took a moment before answering. My hands weren't shaking anymore, that had stopped somewhere on the drive home. My pulse had been steady for hours, but deep in my chest, something remained coiled that had been there since the night this all began, and it showed no intention of releasing. I'm all right, I said. Good. Another pause. Alcott reached out today. She's gone through the preliminary package. Before she can advance it, she needs 2 more items: the full financial trail between Okmulgee Trust and the DEA-flagged account, documented end to end, and something that originated directly from inside the Drennan operation itself. He went quiet for a moment. Gerald, has Nora given any indication? So the hospital rang this morning, I said. Neurological responses. The doctor said it might be days, might take longer. My throat pressed in around the last part. But the direction is right. That's good, Clifford said, and the warmth in it was genuine. I could hear it in how his voice lost its edges. That's genuinely good news. One more piece, I said. One more piece, Clifford said. When I set the phone down, I stayed at the table a long while. The kitchen smelled of old coffee and pencil shavings, and beneath that, the particular stillness of a house that has absorbed one person's years and holds them the way walls hold sound. I thought about Nora lying in that hospital bed, her brain working its way back toward the surface. Like a house after a long blackout, one room at a time, one circuit returning, then another. The lights coming on slowly across a dark building. "Come back," I told the empty kitchen. "Just come back." The oak tree shifted in the wind outside. The refrigerator kept its low hum. Down the block, a dog barked twice, then silence. I picked up my pencil and returned to the work. We put the package together over 2 days at Clifford's kitchen table in Atlanta. I made the drive down on a Friday morning, carrying everything: the legal pads, Petra's analysis, her files loaded on a thumb drive. On the table, the printed open records documents, Dr. Story's modification log screenshots, the written authorization she had signed, permitting use of her findings, and Lucia's phone, which Clifford had already had forensically imaged by a retired FBI technician he trusted. So the original files were preserved with proper chain of custody documentation. Clifford's half of the table held his own materials notes from his conversation with Alcott, a printed summary of the DEA watch list entry for Okmulgee Community Trust, and a yellow legal pad, dense with the small, precise handwriting I recognized from 30 years of correspondence. We worked. That was the only mode either of us had ever had. I organized the financial evidence into 3 sections. First, the Bibb Ridge construction contract fraud, 14 contracts, shell company bid manipulation, all traceable through public records, to Colt Drennan's approvals, and Gideon D. Farnsworth's registered agent network. Second, the money laundering chain, Okmulgee Community Trust, the Delaware Incorporation, the transfer into the Evelyn Callaway Foundation, the DEA flagged source account. Third, the pattern of concealment. Dr. Story's modification log showing interference from the county commissioner's office, the 4 buried APS reports Detective Fenwick had described, and the timeline of Nora's documented injuries across multiple stages of healing. Petra had added something I hadn't requested, but recognized the value of the instant I saw it. A chronological cross-reference table, every event, every document, every financial transaction, laid out in date order on a single spreadsheet, color-coded by category. The kind of work that takes a tangled case and renders it navigable. That converts a mountain of evidence into a sequence any reader can follow. "This is exceptional," I told her when I saw it. She was on the phone from her apartment walking me through it remotely. "I've had 14 months of anger to work with," she said. "Anger is very motivating." When the package was complete, Clifford counted the pages. 119. He squared them against the edge of the table, slid them into a flat document mailer, and sealed it. "All right," he said. He lifted his phone. "I'm going to walk you through exactly what happens next. I want you to have the full picture." He explained it the way he explained everything, clearly, without condescension, crediting me with the intelligence to follow, if he was precise enough to lead. The DOJ Office of Inspector General maintained an encrypted direct submission channel, built specifically for sensitive financial evidence, entirely separate from any state or local system, routed through a federally secured digital network that bypassed all local handling. Clifford had used it throughout his years in the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. His submission credentials and security clearance had remained active after retirement. "The package goes to 2 addresses simultaneously," he said. Brenda Alcott, Special Agent in Charge, FBI Atlanta Financial Crimes Unit, and the Office of the Inspector General, Department of Justice, Washington, D.C. He looked at me. "It doesn't touch a single inbox, a single desk, or a single pair of hands anywhere in Georgia that Harwick Drennan has ever had dealings with. It arrives clean." "How long?" I said. "Alcott will have it by end of business Monday." I nodded. Clifford sealed the mailer with a strip of tamper-evident tape signed across the seal and handed it to the courier. A quiet man in his 60s, who appeared at the door at precisely the time Clifford had arranged, accepting the package with the practiced neutrality of someone who had been carrying things of consequence for a long time, and understood that the weight of them was not his concern. We stood at the window and watched his car back out of the driveway, turn onto the street, and vanish. Clifford exhaled long and slow, the kind of breath a man releases when he has been holding something for longer than he realized. Good, he said. Now we wait. Alcott called on Tuesday afternoon. Clifford had me on speaker at the kitchen table when she came through, a woman's voice measured and exact, carrying the particular cadence of someone who has learned through experience that imprecise language costs cases. Mr. Odom, she said, I've spent 3 days with your package. I'd like to share some preliminary observations. Go ahead, Clifford said. The financial documentation is exceptionally organized. The chronological cross-reference in particular, whoever built that knows exactly what they're doing. A brief pause. The medical record modification log is significant. IP address evidence connecting the county commissioner's office to interference with a domestic violence victim's medical file. We can work with that. And the Ocmulgee Trust connection. That's what elevated this, Clifford said. Her voice shifted, still controlled, but something moved beneath the surface, the sharpening of someone who has just located what they've been hunting for. We've had Ocmulgee Community Trust on passive monitoring for 16 months. We've never managed to establish a domestic connection solid enough to justify moving from passive to active. What you've given us does exactly that. A pause. Mr. Odom, I want to be direct. If the rest of this documentation holds up through our verification process, what you have handed me is a federal RICO case, not county corruption. A RICO case. The word landed in the kitchen like something dropped from a height. I looked at Clifford. He looked at me. The corner of his mouth shifted, not a smile, the shadow of one, the expression of a man who put everything on a single number and just watched it come up. Jatitwang. There are 2 additional items we need. Alcott continued. First, complete financial documentation of the Ocmulgee Trust to DEA-flagged account transfer. Your package includes the Form 990 and the trust registration, but we need the actual wire transfer records. Our financial forensics team can subpoena those, but a preliminary trace from your end would accelerate our timeline considerably. Another pause. Second, Mr. Odom, you referenced a potential internal source. If that source is holding direct audio evidence of instructions being given, it changes the entire calculus. We're working on both, Clifford said. Understood. A brief silence. Mr. Odom, tell whoever assembled this package that it is very good work. Another pause, and when she came back, her voice had lost a degree of its official register, quieter, slightly less formal. I've reviewed Nora Calloway Drennan's medical file. The original. A beat. Tell whoever her father is that I understand why he's doing this. The line went quiet. I'll tell him, Clifford said. After Alcott hung up, I sat at the table and pressed the heels of my hands against my eyes and breathed. Just breathed in and out while the full scale of what was in motion settled over me, the way weather settles the air pressure changing before you can name what's different. Then my phone buzzed on the table. Unknown number, a text, 3 words, no punctuation, no signature. Back away, Calloway. I held the phone and read it twice. Then I set it face down, picked up my pencil, and wrote in the legal pad, unknown threat. 4:47 p.m., Tuesday. Drennan's aware package is moving. I underlined the date. They were frightened. And in my experience, a frightened man is the most legible man there is. The waiting was the hardest part. I had spent 35 years learning patience with numbers, learning to sit with an unfinished picture, and hold off filling in the gaps until the evidence earned it. But those had been other people's numbers, other people's problems, Other people's lives suspended in the balance. This was different. This was Nora in a hospital bed, 2 counties north, her brain working its slow way back toward the surface, while I sat at a kitchen table and waited for a federal apparatus to move on its own schedule. I called the hospital every morning at 8. The overnight nurse on Nora's floor had learned my voice by the 3rd day. "Same as yesterday, Mr. Calloway," she would say. "Stable, moving in the right direction." I wrote those words at the top of a fresh page in the legal pad every morning, the way some people write affirmations or prayers. It was the closest thing to hope I had learned to hold without gripping so hard it shattered. Clifford called on a Wednesday morning, 11 days after the package had gone out. "Gideon Farnsworth," he said. "You remember that name?" We had him flagged as the registered agent on the Bibb Ridge Shell Companies, but he also held a position as Bibb County tax assessor. That was how he sat on both ends of the financial network at once. I remember him," I said. "He appeared twice in Petra's cross-reference as a signatory on Bibb Ridge financial certifications." That's him. Clifford's voice had taken on the particular texture of controlled excitement, the tone of a man who has been watching dominoes and has just heard the first one fall. FBI Financial Crimes ran the Okmulgee Trust wire transfer records through their subpoena process. Took them 6 days. Farnsworth's personal accounts show 11 years of deposits that bear no relationship to his county salary. Structured deposits kept just under the $10,000 federal reporting threshold. Classic structuring. They approached him, I said, the day before. Routine federal contact. 2 agents, his lawyer in the room, the full evidentiary package spread out in front of them. Clifford let that land. Gideon Farnsworth spent 3 hours behind closed doors in that attorney's office. When he stepped back out, his signature was on a cooperation agreement. I laid my pencil across the table. Steady hands. Somewhere beneath my sternum, a tension that had been wound for weeks unwound itself by one meaningful notch. "How many names?" I asked. 31, Clifford said. 31 county officials, sheriff's deputies, 2 sitting judges, the planning commission chair, 4 members off the contracts review board. The pause that followed had mass. "Gerald, one of those names, is the officer who shut down the first APS report on Nora 14 months back." The room around me went still in a particular way. Not the silence of absence, the silence of arrival, the kind that fills a space when something you've suspected for months gets confirmed out loud. Gideon handed them 11 years of it. Every dollar, every date, every mechanism. He laid bare the entire architecture, how Harwick Drennan had assembled his protection network, brick by brick, from nothing over years. Another pause. "You want to know why he moved so quickly? Because the evidence didn't leave him a choice," I said. The question wasn't whether he'd talk. It was whether he could negotiate any cushion for himself before it all came down. That's exactly right. Clifford said, "A man's own words are the one thing he cannot argue away." I picked my pencil back up. I put it on paper, Gideon Farnsworth Cooperation Agreement signed. 31 names. Full network architecture. Wednesday. Then a second call came through a number I placed immediately as the Bibb County Sheriff's Department. I picked up. "Mr. Calloway." Fenwick's voice was subdued, slightly abraded. The voice of someone phoning from a spot where being overheard would be a problem. "I need to keep this short. There are 2 federal agents working Bibb County as of this morning who have no connection to this department. They walked in without a word to anyone here. A beat. I can't tell you what you set in motion or how, but those agents bypassing our office entirely, that tells me someone upstream made certain we couldn't run interference." His voice went tight. 19 years I've been a detective. Not once in all that time has a federal team entered this county without first calling the sheriff's office as a professional courtesy. A shorter pause. I thought you ought to know. Thank you, detective. Don't thank me, he said. His voice fell lower still. I let things go that I shouldn't have. Just what I'm doing right now is the most useful thing I've managed in a long while. He cleared his throat, a hard, effortful sound. A man forcing something back down that kept wanting to surface. How's your daughter? She moving forward? I said yes. Long pause on his end. Good, he said. That's good. Then barely above a murmur more to the air than to me good. The line went dead. I held the phone in my hand and sat with it. 19 years, Fenwick had said. 19 years of watching how this county functioned, of learning to file the bad things away, to close the folders, to convince himself that the machinery was bigger than any single person and immovable besides. And here he was, phoning from a quiet corner of his own department to report that 2 federal agents had shown up unannounced. There was something in the texture of his voice, the sound of a man who had carried a held breath so long it had become part of him, and who had just finally been told he could put it down. My mind went to the 4 reports. The first one filed 14 months ago by an officer whose name now appeared on Gideon Farnsworth's cooperation list. 14 months. All that time Nora was inside that house. Bruises coming in, fading, coming back. Colt was signing contracts. Harwick was tending to his network. Nadine was running money through the Evelyn Calloway Foundation. 14 months. I pushed back from the table and moved to the kitchen window. Outside, the oak tree stood in the gray morning air. December had stripped it completely, no cover left, every branch and joint exposed, the skeleton of the thing on full display. That is what the cold season does. It removes every softening layer until only the actual structure remains. My phone rang a second time. Clifford Odom had just called him, he said, and whatever careful restraint had been threading his voice before was gone, now replaced by something crisper and more urgent. Gerald Harwick Drennan's own attorney reached out to the DOJ this morning. Harwick is looking to explore a proffer agreement. My fingers closed harder around the phone. He's positioning to hand over Nadine and Colt, I said. He's going to attempt it, Clifford said. Meaning the pressure has become undeniable, and he's running the numbers on who he can exchange for leniency. A pause. There's something else it means they still haven't learned about Nora's phone. If that evidence were on their radar, he wouldn't be floating deals. He'd be gone. He doesn't know, I said. Not yet, Clifford said. Tell me she wakes up. I looked out at that oak tree stripped to its core, nothing decorative, left purely itself against the December sky. She's going to wake up, I said. I'm certain of it. I wasn't present when it happened. I want to say that plainly. After all of it, the legal pads filled edge to edge, the open records requests, those 2 days at Clifford's kitchen table, constructing a package precise enough and clean enough to reach the people who actually had authority. I was nowhere near Bibb County when the agents moved in. 7 in the morning, my own kitchen coffee going cold beside my notepad. I found out the way you find out about things you weren't there for, secondhand, assembled from fragments. Clifford was first at 6:47 before I'd gotten through my first cup. It's moving, he said. Alcott pushed through the warrants this morning. 6:15 a.m. entries executed simultaneously at the County Commissioner's Office, Bibb Ridge Construction Headquarters, and the private residence. A pause. Gerald, it's moving. I placed my coffee cup back on the table with deliberate care, no tremor in my hands. That caught me off guard. After the months of pressure and sleepless arithmetic, I had expected something, some physical evidence of release. But they were calm in the way that hands sometimes go calm when the threat they've been tensed against finally materializes and the tensing has nowhere left to go. The accounts, I said. Frozen at 6 a.m., Bib Ridge operating accounts. The Okmulgee Community Trust accounts. 3 accounts under Harwick Drennan's personal name. Another pause. There's a 4th Cayman Islands registration flagged through a DEA trace. Alcott's team is running the international process on that one. It takes time, but it'll arrive. I got it all onto paper. Time date accounts, frozen locations entered 35 years of the same habit. When facts are still warm and precise, that's when you write them. Then I drove to Bibb County. There was no real deliberation involved. I became aware that I was southbound on the highway, hands on the wheel, a low-grade December sky pressing down from above. I had to be there not to mark a victory, not to see confirmation I still doubted, but the way someone who has spent a long season inside a problem sometimes has to physically go and stand where it broke open and breathe the air there and let the finish become real in their body. 2 blocks from the county commissioner's office, I parked on a side street and walked to the corner. 4 unmarked federal vehicles occupied the lot. A pair of agents in dark jackets held position at the main entrance. A 3rd moved through the front door carrying a load of files, banker's boxes stacked on a hand truck, the standard containers for seized documents. On the far sidewalk, a loose group of county employees had collected some with cups of coffee, all of them wearing the face people wear when they've just seen the foundation shift beneath something they assumed was fixed in place forever. I stood at that corner and took a long look. 3 months ago, that building had been the engine room of everything that ran this county. The place that sheltered the man who buried complaints and purchased judicial outcomes and dissolved inconvenient problems. Now there were 4 government vehicles in its lot, and agents walking its records out the door in cardboard boxes. The exterior hadn't changed at all. Same brick facade, same flagpole, same chiseled letters over the entry, Bibb County Commissioner. But the authority that had lived inside it was absent, and the absence had a quality you could perceive from where I stood a full 2 blocks removed. My phone rang. Detective Fenwick. I answered. Mr. Calloway. His voice had a rawness I hadn't heard from him before, worn all the way through, right down to something exposed underneath. The voice of a man who'd been awake since the dark hours, running on something that had nothing to do with rest or caffeine. I can see you're here. I scanned the street, found him half a block off beside an unmarked cruiser phone, against his ear eyes already on me. I moved in his direction. We came together on the pavement outside a hardware store that hadn't opened yet. Its windows dark, a hand-lettered sign taped to the door reading back at 10 o'clock. Fenwick looked awful ashen heavy beneath the eyes, his jacket carrying the deep creases of a garment slept in rather than hung. He extended his hand, and I took it. "I owe you an apology," he said. His voice fractured on that last word. Fractured and stayed fractured. Didn't come back together. "I owe Nora an apology. I owe—" He stopped, pressed his lips into a hard line. His jaw was working against something. 4 reports, Mr. Calloway. I pulled every one of them this morning out of the archive myself, because I had to look at them with my own eyes. His gaze was bright and terrible. She was right there. Each and every time. And each time someone above me made a phone call, the file got closed, and I convinced myself my hands were tied. Boyd. I said the first time I'd used his given name, and it brought him up short. He looked at me. "You told me the truth," I said. "The night I showed up at that hospital, you had every reason to give me the official version and send me on my way. You didn't do that. You walked me into that hallway and laid out exactly how the machine functioned, and exactly where it was broken, knowing what it might cost you. I kept my eyes on his, and 3 weeks back, you called from a quiet corner of your own department to report that federal agents had come in. That counts for something. Fenwick's jaw was still working. His eyes were very bright. He pressed the back of his hand against his mouth, the gesture of a man applying pressure to himself, someone who has resolved that he will not break down on a public sidewalk in front of a person whose opinion he values. Then he dropped his hand and pushed out a hard breath. "It's not enough," he said. "No," I said. "It isn't. But it was what you had, and you put it to use." He gave one nod, short, tight, a little jerky. The nod of someone not yet willing to accept forgiveness, but able to hear that the ledger wasn't entirely bare. My phone buzzed. "Clifford." 1 minute, I told Fenwick. I moved a few steps off and answered. Harwick Drennan's attorney had just submitted the formal paperwork to the DOJ, Clifford said. He's handing them Nadine and Colt, the racketeering structure, the money laundering chain, the contract fraud, all of it packaged for a cooperation agreement. "Does he know about Nora's phone?" I said. "No," Clifford said. "If he knew, he'd have vanished, not lawyered up." A pause. "But Gerald the proffer doesn't guarantee him anything. The DOJ can still bring charges across the board if the evidence is there. And if Nora has what we believe she has it," I said. "I'm certain of it." "Then it doesn't matter what Harwick puts on the table," Clifford said, his voice dropping, "because his own recorded words will be what finishes him." I looked back toward Fenwick, standing on the sidewalk with both hands buried in his coat pockets, eyes fixed on the federal vehicles 2 blocks up the street, the expression of a man finally watching something he had been waiting a long time to see. "Clifford," I said, "I need to get to the hospital." Clifford reached me the next morning at 9:14. I was in the hospital parking lot, sitting with the engine off, not quite ready to go inside. The night before, I had driven up to Atlanta, not solely to see Nora, though I had gone in, held her hand for 20 minutes, watched the monitors draw their slow and steady lines, and told myself that steady was sufficient for now. I had come up because I needed to be in proximity to the machinery that was turning, even if I had no part in its turning. I was working through my second cup of gas station coffee when the call came. "You need to hear this," Clifford said. He had the voice of someone who had just witnessed something extraordinary and was still finding the words to frame it. "Are you in a place where you can talk?" "Parking lot," I said. "Go ahead." He talked for 11 minutes. I didn't say a word. What had unfolded inside the DOJ negotiation rooms over the prior 48 hours, Clifford had pieced it together from Alcott, who had been in the room for parts of it, and briefed on the rest. I wasn't there. I will never possess a complete account. Only the contours, only the shape of what happened as it came to me through other people's words. But the contours were sufficient. Harwick Drennan had entered the DOJ negotiation, carrying his personal attorney and a leather-bound ledger he had been maintaining since 1986. 35 years of handwritten entries, names, dates, dollar amounts, services rendered. Every judge he had paid, every official he had cultivated, every favor extended, and everyone called back in. He had kept it the way a particular kind of man keeps records, not out of any moral impulse, but out of a need for dominion. The comfort of knowing that every transaction was preserved on paper and that everyone he had paid was therefore in some durable sense owned by him. He offered the ledger as the heart of his cooperation package. What he wanted in return: full immunity on the racketeering counts and reduced exposure on the money laundering. In plain terms, he intended to deliver his wife and his son to the federal government and leave the room with his freedom more or less whole. He sat across that table, Clifford said, and he started with Nadine. The Evelyn Callaway Foundation transfers. the Okmulgee Community Trust structure, the DEA-flagged account. He walked them through all of it and told them Nadine had constructed it. Nadine had run it. Nadine had been the chief architect of the financial concealment. A pause. Then he gave them Colt, the Bibb Ridge construction contracts, the fraudulent bid structure, the deed of trust he had pressured Nora into signing. I was gripping my coffee cup hard enough that the plastic had started to give. And, Nadine, I said. Nadine's attorney submitted a counter-proffer 4 hours later. Clifford's voice was very dry. She gave them Harwick, full chain of command, documentation, emails and text messages she had preserved going back 9 years, establishing that Harwick had originated, approved, and directed every component of the financial scheme. A pause. She also gave them something Harwick hadn't put on the table. She confirmed that the pressure campaign against Nora, the sustained effort to keep her silent, had been initiated and personally overseen by Harwick. My jaw ached from how hard I was holding it. And Colt, I said. Colt's attorney reached out to the DOJ at 7 this morning, Clifford said. He held out roughly 36 hours before he came apart entirely. He delivered the full command structure, every directive from Harwick, every approval chain, every exchange between himself and his father regarding the land contracts and the financial arrangements. Another pause. He also confirmed the timeline on Nora's house. Who issued the order? Who was there? Who knew? The parking lot was quiet around me. 2 floors up, Nora was in a hospital bed, monitors drawing their steady lines moving in the right direction. I sat with what Clifford was describing. 3 people, 3 separate rooms, each one feeding the others into the machine. Each one working out that their own survival meant someone else going down. A family that had functioned for 30 years as a single organism, controlling, absorbing, consolidating, reduced in 48 hours to 3 individuals, pointing fingers at each other across conference tables. Clifford, I said, does Harwick's proffer hold? Does he get the immunity he's after? A pause. Here's the thing, Clifford said. The DOJ hasn't accepted it. The proffer gives them useful corroboration on the financial architecture, but it doesn't deliver direct command evidence on what happened to Nora. Without that, there's an argument to be made, a thin one, but an argument that Harwick ran the financial scheme without direct personal involvement in what was done to her. His voice went careful. If that argument gains any ground, Gerald, he could work his way down to a significantly reduced exposure. I looked up through the windshield at the hospital building. He won't, I said. Gerald, his voice carried a warning I didn't want to hear. He won't get that deal, I said. Because Nora is going to wake up, and when she does, what she gives us will make his proffer completely worthless. I put the empty cup on the dashboard. I taught her something, Clifford, years before the wedding. I sat her down and said, if you're ever in a situation where someone holds power over you and you can't get free, the most valuable thing you can do is document. Keep records. And if you're ever in genuine danger, keep the cloud recording running. A long pause on the line. You think she did, Clifford said. I think she is her father's daughter, I said, and her mother's as well. Evelyn kept records of everything. Every receipt, every letter, every exchange that had any weight to it. Nora grew up watching that. It isn't something you teach in a single sitting. It's something that seeps in over years. My throat constricted. She has been in that bed for weeks. And the thought I keep returning to, the one I cannot leave alone, is that she knew. Before any of this began to surface, some part of her saw it coming and got ready. Clifford was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped and taken on a carefulness he didn't usually carry. Petra called me yesterday, he said. She finished the final pass on the financial cross-reference. 112 data points, everyone sourced, everyone time-stamped. He let that sit a moment. She wanted me to tell you she's ready. Whatever comes next, she's prepared for it. I thought about Petra at that corner table in the coffee shop, both hands circling a cup, 14 months of anger pressed down into a spreadsheet that could walk anyone who understood it through the anatomy of the corruption. I thought about Dr. Story in her locked office, hands trembling against the desk, but her voice not wavering. I thought about Lucia on a highway heading north, a worn flip-style smartphone with a hairline crack across the screen, tucked in a coat that was a size too large for her, finally moving toward something, rather than away from it. I thought about the people who build the thing that brings the wall down, how seldom they get to be present when it falls. How much of the work happens in small rooms, legal pads, cold coffee, and the falling occurs somewhere else entirely, in rooms you are not permitted to enter. Witnessed by people whose faces you will never see. Tell Petra thank you, I said. Tell her it counted. Every last piece of it counted. I climbed out of the car. The December air was cold and sharp-edged, the kind that makes you conscious of the outline of your own face. I stood in that parking lot a moment and looked up at the hospital windows 2 floors above me. Third from the left, the room where Nora was moving in the right direction. Something shifted inside me that wasn't quite hope and wasn't quite certainty, but occupied the territory between them, the place you reach when you have done everything within your power, and whatever remains has passed out of your hands. Then I went inside. The nurse at the second-floor station looked up the instant I came through the stairwell door, and her expression moved before she'd gotten a single word out, a brightening, a quickening, the unmistakable look of someone who has been sitting on good news and watching the door for the one person it belongs to. "Mr. Calloway," she said, already on her feet. "She's been asking for you." My hand went to the wall beside me. I pressed my palm flat against it and held myself there, just breathing, while those 4 words rearranged everything inside my chest. "She's been asking for you." "Since when?" I said. The voice that came out wasn't quite mine, too high, not right. "About an hour ago," she said. Her name was Colleen. I knew that well by now. I had spoken to her every morning for weeks. Her eyes were warm and steady. She woke gradually, she said. Disoriented at first, which was expected after the concussion and the time she'd been under. But she'd been oriented for roughly 40 minutes, and the first thing she said once she understood where she was, Colleen stopped, pressed her lips together. Her eyes had gone bright with something she was working to hold back. She said, "I need my dad. Can someone please call my dad?" I pushed off from the wall and went down the hallway. The room was the same room it had always been. Same monitors, same chrome pole, same window looking out over the parking lot. But the figure in the bed was different now. She was sitting up carefully, propped against pillows, left arm still wrapped in bandages, her face still showing the faded yellow-green remnant of old bruising. Her eyes were open. Her eyes were open, and they found me the second I crossed the threshold, and they didn't release me. "Dad," she said. One word. It shouldn't have been enough to do what it did, but it left her in a voice roughened by weeks of silence, worn at the edges, and absolutely unmistakably hers. It struck me somewhere below the sternum, with the accumulated weight of everything I had been holding back for so long, that the holding had become invisible. I had ceased to notice I was doing it until the moment I stopped. I covered the room in 4 strides and sat on the edge of the bed and put my arms around my daughter with great care, aware of the bandages, the IV line, every place that was still mending. She brought her good arm up around my neck and held on. I put my face against her hair and I let myself cry. Not the contained, managed version I'd been producing in parking lots and kitchens and the front seats of cars. Actually cry shoulders, moving breath, coming apart everything that had been held behind 35 years of audit discipline and 5 years of widowhood and 6 weeks of constructing a case on a legal pad, suddenly finding the door open and pouring through all at once. Nora was crying too. I felt it, her chest shaking against mine, her fingers knotting into my shirt, her voice reaching me muffled from my shoulder. Dad, I'm sorry. I should have told you. I should have called you sooner. And I kept saying, no, don't apologize. You have nothing to apologize for. Just hold on. Hold on. We stayed like that a long time. When we finally drew apart, we were both hollowed out and red-eyed and undone, and neither of us was the least bit self-conscious about it. Colleen had slipped out at some point and drawn the door nearly shut behind her, for which I was grateful. Nora looked at me. She reached up with her good hand and touched my face briefly, lightly, the same way she had touched it when she was 4 years old and needed to be certain I was paying attention. You know, she said. It wasn't a question, most of it, I said. She nodded, slow and deliberate. Her eyes were very clear. Whatever the concussion had temporarily taken, it had returned. She was entirely herself, entirely present, and I could see behind her eyes the particular quality of someone who has spent weeks flat on their back, with nothing but time to think, and who has arrived somewhere on the far side of it, a stillness that was close to peace. There's something I need to give you, she said. She reached beneath her pillow, a motion so deliberate, so practiced, that it was plain she had rehearsed it many times in her mind before her hand actually moved. She drew out a phone. Small, older model screen, dark. She held it toward me. I took it. The night it happened, she said, her voice dropping, becoming careful and precise, the cadence of someone recounting something they have gone over many times. Before Colt came home, I could hear them on the phone downstairs, him and his father. Harwick's voice was coming up through the floor, and I remembered what you told me. She held my gaze. Before the wedding, you sat me down and said, Nora, if you are ever in a situation where someone has power over you and you cannot get out, document everything. And if you are ever in real danger, always keep the cloud recording running. Always keep the cloud recording running, she repeated. Her chin was trembling, but her voice stayed level. I went down to the kitchen. I laid the phone on the counter face down. I pressed record. Then I went back upstairs, and I waited. My hands tightened around the phone. I looked at this small, ordinary object, a 5-year-old handset with a cracked corner on the case, and I understood what it had cost her to hold onto it, to conceal it, to spend weeks in a hospital bed, drifting in and out, and keep it protected under her pillow, because some part of her, even when words were beyond her reach, had known that it was important. Nora, I said, and her name broke in my throat. How long had you been keeping this? Since the week before it happened, she said. I started recording things 3 weeks before. Dad, I knew things were getting worse. I didn't know how far it would go, but I could feel the trajectory. And I thought her voice snagged. She brought her lips together, hard-breathed through her nose, pulled herself back level. I thought if something happened to me, I wanted something to exist. I wanted there to be a record. Because I know what you always say. Numbers don't lie, I said. Numbers don't lie, she said, and neither do recordings. I opened the audio files. There were 11 of them. I pressed play on the most recent file dated the night she was admitted. The recording wasn't clean. Kitchen sounds underneath everything, footsteps, a door somewhere in the distance, and then voices. 2 of them. One arriving through a phone speaker, older, commanding the voice of a man long used to compliance. The other in the room itself. Harwick Drennan's voice came through that small speaker with enough clarity that the words left no room for interpretation. Take care of it tonight, Colt. I've already spoken to the department. No one is going to ask questions we don't want asked. Do you understand me? And Colt's voice flat acquiescent, the voice of a man who had surrendered his own judgment some time ago. I understand. I stopped the playback. The room settled into silence. I sat on the edge of my daughter's bed with a small phone in my shaking hands, looking at the dark screen, thinking about Harwick Drennan, seated in a DOJ negotiation room, trying to argue that the financial crimes belonged to someone else, that he had no direct hand in what happened to Nora, specifically that the distance between himself and this kitchen was wide enough to construct a defense around. There was no such distance. There had never been. His own voice had closed that door. "Dad," Nora said. I looked up. Her eyes were full, right at the edge, holding the way eyes hold just before they release. Her chin was still unsteady, but the look she was giving me wasn't only grief, wasn't only relief. It was something older and quieter than either. The expression of a person who did a hard thing alone in a dark moment and then held onto it long enough to place it in the right hands. "You told me to keep it running," she said. I kept it running. I reached out and took her hand, the unbandaged one, her right, and held it between both of mine. "I know," I said. The words barely made it out. "I know you did." I was in the hallway 2 minutes later calling Clifford. "Clifford," I said, "tell Agent Alcott that Harwick Drennan's proffer agreement is done. We have his voice on record giving the direct order." I leaned back against the wall, the phone still warm from Nora's hiding place, pressed flat against my chest with my free hand. "It's over." A pause. Then Clifford, very quietly, "Good," he said. "Gerald, that's very good. It took 14 months. I want to say that plainly, without any embellishment, because the number carries weight. 14 months from the morning federal agents walked into the Bibb County Commissioner's office with banker's boxes and tamper-evident seals to the morning I put on my one good suit and drove to Atlanta. 14 months of Nora's recovery, the cast coming off in stages, physical therapy twice a week, the sessions with the counselor in Warner Robins, who had a quiet office and a waiting room with decent light, and who Nora said after the third visit was the first person who had ever thought to ask her the right questions. 14 months of legal proceedings moving at the pace federal bureaucracy sets, which is to say slowly and then all at once. 14 months of Petra Lund rebuilding her professional life. Of Dr. Story continuing her practice at Macon Regional Medical Center after the Georgia Medical Board reviewed the evidence and formally closed the complaint against her license. Of Lucia Fuentes beginning again in Nashville, supported by the advocacy organization Clifford had connected her with. 14 months. And then, a Tuesday morning in February, the Atlanta sky overhead, flat and white. I was pulling into a federal courthouse garage, hands steady on the wheel, the legal pad on the passenger seat, open to a fresh page with a single line at the top, "Today." The courtroom was smaller than I'd pictured it. I had spent a career in government buildings and knew their particular register, the marriage of marble and fluorescent light, the way they make routine human transactions feel at once consequential and procedural. The federal courtroom on the 4th floor of the Richard B. Russell Federal Building was no different in that regard. Wood paneling gallery rose an elevated bench, and behind it at 9:03 a.m., Judge Rosalind Abernethy took her seat. She was a compact woman in her late 50s, close-cropped natural hair, going silver at the temples, carrying the particular quality of stillness that accumulates in people who have presided over difficult rooms for a long time and learned that stillness functions as its own authority. She arranged her papers without hurry. She surveyed the room without theater. Her gaze moved across the gallery in a slow, even sweep, the look of someone conducting a precise inventory. Nora was beside me. She had attended every procedural hearing over those 14 months quietly, without announcement, occupying gallery seats and watching the machinery of federal prosecution advance through its stages. Today, she wore a dark blue coat, her hair-down hands folded in her lap, sitting very straight in the particular way she sits when she is holding something difficult with deliberate composure. Clifford was on my other side in his good jacket, hands resting on his knee, watching the front of the room with the focused patience of a man who has waited on things before and understands that waiting is part of the work. 2 rows behind us, I didn't need to look to know, was Reverend Vernon Ibarra. He had driven up from Bibb County the night before, phoned me at 7 p.m. to say he was coming, that he had carried this for 11 years and meant to be present for the end of it. When I'd turned around before the proceedings began, he caught my eye and gave a single nod, the same nod he had offered me across a hospital waiting room 14 months ago, but with something different threaded through it now. Something close to resolved. And in the second row to our left, Petra Lund, dressed sharply, chin up, her laptop bag on the floor at her feet. She had stopped bringing it everywhere about 6 months back, when she took the position at the cybersecurity firm in Atlanta. Today, she'd carried it out again from habit, or perhaps from memory. When I caught her eye before the proceedings began, she gave me a tight, fierce smile that said in an instant what would have taken several sentences to put into words. The plea hearings proceeded in sequence. Federal plea proceedings under Rule 11 require the judge to address each defendant personally, to confirm their understanding of the charges and their consequences, and to satisfy herself that the plea is voluntary and that a factual basis supports the guilty finding. Judge Abernethy worked through each one with the same unhurried thoroughness. No shortcuts, no ceremony, just the careful labor of a system holding itself to account. Colt came first. He was thinner than I remembered from the hospital waiting room. The ease had been ground out of him 14 months of federal process and the particular kind of erosion that comes from watching the members of your own family take the stand against you. He stood at the defense table in a charcoal suit and answered Judge Abernethy's questions in a flat, compliant voice. When she asked him to confirm the factual basis of his plea, the contract fraud, the financial manipulation, the pressure campaign against Nora, he said yes to each count in a tone that held no argument, no resistance. Nadine came second. She was smaller than I had built her up to be in my imagination. I had constructed her from Lucia's recordings, from the clipped authority of her voice issuing instructions, and the physical reality of her was somehow reduced by the scale of the courtroom. She stood very straight and spoke in a clear, controlled voice and showed no emotion I could identify, which told me more about her than any display of feeling would have. Harwick came last. He approached the defense table with the measured, deliberate gait of a man who has determined that dignity is the last asset he possesses and intends to protect it. He was in his late 60s, silver-haired, still holding the physical ease of someone accustomed to rooms orienting themselves around him. But this room was not orienting itself around him. This was a federal courtroom, and the woman at the bench had never been to his Christmas party, and there was no pension fund within his reach. I watched him register that in real time as he stood before her, and I will be honest, it was something to witness. Judge Abernethy addressed him directly. "Mr. Drennan," she said, "you are before this court to enter a guilty plea to the following federal charges." She read them. Racketeering, conspiracy to commit wire fraud, money laundering, obstruction of justice, conspiracy to tamper with a witness. That last count, conspiracy to tamper with a witness, was the box the law had found for what had been done to Nora. It wasn't the charge I would have drafted if the language were mine to choose. It was a legal category, a classification, a container the system had located for something that resisted containment. But it was something. It was the system speaking in the only language available to it, This happened, it was wrong, and it now has a name. Judge Abernethy asked Harwick whether he understood the charges. Yes, he said. She asked whether his plea was entered voluntarily. Yes, he said. She asked him to confirm the factual basis. She went through it methodically, the financial scheme, the obstruction of investigations, the direction of the pressure campaign against Nora Calloway Drennan. Before he answered that last one, there was a pause. 3 seconds roughly. I counted. Yes, he said. Judge Abernethy held her gaze on him for a moment. Then she looked down at her papers. Then she accepted the plea. I made no sound. I didn't move. I sat in my gallery seat with both hands folded over the legal pad in my lap, looking toward the front of the room, breathing one breath, 2, 3, while the room continued its work around me. The attorneys conferring, the court reporter's fingers moving, the machinery of conclusion doing what it does. Nora reached over and placed her hand on mine. I turned to look at her. Her eyes were wet but not spilling full, the way eyes go when what they're holding exceeds their capacity. She said nothing. She kept her hand over mine and we looked at each other while the room around us completed its business. From behind us came the sound of Reverend Ibarra exhaling long, slow, deep. The exhale of a man finally putting down something he has been carrying for 11 years. It was the loudest thing in the room. When the proceedings ended and the courtroom began to clear, I remained in my seat a moment longer. I opened the legal pad to the single line written that morning. Today. I drew a straight line through it, the mark of an auditor closing an account. Not bitter, not triumphant. Just final. Just done. Then I stood turned, and Reverend Ibarra was there with his hand extended, his eyes very bright. Clifford was there. Petra was there with that fierce, tight smile gone wide and uncontrolled. She was actually laughing quietly. Her hand pressed over her mouth the way people laugh when the relief is simply too large for any other form of release. And Nora was beside me, her arm threaded through mine. "Come on," she said. "Let's go home, Dad." A year after the plea hearings, on an evening in late July, when the Georgia heat had finally relented, and the air moving through the kitchen screen door carried the smell of cut grass and cooling earth, I sat on the front porch of my house and did nothing at all. I want to put that simply because it was not as uncomplicated as it sounds. I could not accurately calculate the last time I had done genuinely nothing. No legal pad, no pencil, no document to read or trace back to its origin. The habit of work is my deepest habit. Deeper than sleep, deeper than hunger. Evelyn used to say I would audit the grocery list if she left me to my own devices long enough. She wasn't far wrong, but tonight there was no legal pad. There was a glass of iced tea going warm on the porch railing, and the oak tree in the yard shifting in the evening wind, and Nora in the other chair with a paperback and her feet tucked up beneath her. That was everything. That was the whole of it. Clifford had left an hour earlier. He had driven up from Atlanta for the afternoon, which had begun to feel like a pattern, a welcome one, the kind that takes hold, when two people recognize they have been acquaintances their whole lives and have only just found their way to something more like friendship. He had brought tomatoes from Clifford's garden, which he tended with the same methodical care he applied to everything else. We had eaten on the porch and talked about things that bore no relation to evidence packages or federal proceedings or the mechanics of consequence. We talked about his grandson who was learning to walk. We talked about a book I had been meaning to read for 3 years. We talked about Evelyn, which we did more often these days, not with pain, but the way you talk about someone who was real and mattered and remains part of the conversation even when they are no longer in the room. The news from everyone was good. Lucia had found work at a nonprofit in Nashville helping immigrant families with housing navigation. 3 weeks ago, she had sent a handwritten card, careful English, the kind built up through years of patient effort, along with a photograph of a bluebird perched on a fence rail in the frost. I put it on the refrigerator next to Evelyn's photograph, which felt exactly right. Petra had texted 3 days ago, promoted senior analyst, thought you should know. I called her immediately. She laughed the way she had laughed in the federal courthouse, relief too large to be contained by any other expression, and we talked for 40 minutes about everything except Bibb County, which was, I thought, precisely the right amount of time to devote to that subject. Dr. Story had driven up 2 months ago for dinner. She arrived with a bottle of Virginia wine she had researched specifically for the occasion, and stayed until nearly 11, which was later than either Nora or I had anticipated. She turned out to be genuinely funny, dry observational. The humor of someone who has spent a career at the side of people in their most exposed moments, and learned to use laughter as a means of endurance. We made plans to do it again in the fall. Reverend Ibarra had called last week. Bibb County, he said, was breathing differently. A new commissioner named Cecile Drummond had won a special election in March on a transparency platform, and in her first 2 months had commissioned an independent audit of every county contract issued over the previous decade. When he told me that last part, I had to set the phone down and gather myself, which Reverend Ibarra had apparently found entertaining. "Gerald," he said when I picked back up, "the Lord has a sense of humor." "He does," I said. "He really does." Nora looked up from her book. "You're staring at the tree again." "I'm not staring," I said. "I'm observing." "That's what you always say." She closed the book, thumb holding her place. Her face had healed entirely. No trace of the bruising, no sign of the stitches, just her face, the one I had known all her life. The one that favored Evelyn around the eyes and me around the jaw, which Evelyn had always called unfortunate for Nora, and which I had always received as a compliment. "What are you observing?" "That the lower left branch wants pruning," I said. "And that your mother planted this tree 30 years ago in the mud with you alongside her, and you mostly just covered yourself in dirt and asked questions." Nora was quiet for a moment. The porch light was on. The yard beyond was going dark, fireflies beginning their slow, patient work among the lower branches of the oak. She would have liked today. Nora said not a question, a declaration, the kind that comes from having turned something over long enough to be certain of it. She would have liked today. I agreed. She would have said I took too long. Nora smiled slow, real, the smile that had been returning in stages over 14 months, each stage arriving a little more easily than the last. She would have been right. She usually was. I pushed up from the porch chair, went inside, and came back with the last legal pad from the box on top of the refrigerator. I sat down, opened it to the first page, and looked at the single word I had written there in my own hand on the morning I decided to begin. Drennan. I looked at it a long time. Then I picked up a pencil. I drew one straight line through the name, unhurried level, the line of a man closing an account that has been fully and finally settled. I closed the legal pad and set it on the porch railing. I thought about Evelyn not as the absence of her, not as the contour her leaving had pressed into everything around it, but as herself. The woman who crouched in the mud in her good jeans, explaining root systems to a 2-year-old. The woman who told me 20 years ago that you don't fight fires with your fists, you find where they started. The woman whose name had been taken by people who had no understanding of what it meant, and whose taking had in the end only helped bring them down. "Evelyn," I said quietly to the oak tree in the yard in the July evening, "the books are balanced. I thought you should know." Nora reached over and laid her hand on my arm. I placed my hand over hers. There we sat in the July dusk, father and daughter, and let the silence be what it was, not hollow. Not the silence of words swallowed back, but the full silence of something finished, of a ledger balanced, of a burden set down after years of carrying it. A firefly rose from the low branches of the oak and held itself in the air a moment, burning very bright before it winked out. I watched it. I thought of Evelyn. I smiled. That July evening, sitting beside my daughter in the quiet, I understood for the first time in a long while what it felt like to put something down and not pick it back up. This road was long. It cost years of sleep, a marriage's worth of grief turned sideways, and the kind of anger that burns so low and steady you stop noticing the heat. But I believe God does not let a record go unread forever. The Lord's timing is not our timing, and sometimes the accounting comes late quietly, through a daughter who hid a phone under her pillow and a detective who finally chose his conscience over his pension. If this grandpa story's kind of story, one man, one family, one long fight for what is right, means anything to you, then here is what I would want you to carry away from it. Document everything always. Not because you plan to go to war, but because the truth needs a home before someone tries to erase it. If an institution tells you a problem does not exist, find out who that institution answers to. That answer will tell you everything. Never let someone use a good name, especially the name of someone you loved, to move dirty money in the dark. Guard that legacy the way you would guard the person themselves. And if the weight feels unbearable, hold on. The moment of proof almost always arrives when you have done everything in your power and finally surrendered the outcome. This has been a family revenge story that I never wanted to live and could not afford to leave untold. If it reached something in you, leave a comment below and tell me what stayed with you. Share it with someone who is carrying a quiet fight of their own. And if you want more stories like this one, subscribe to Calm Family Revenge. I will be here. Thank you for listening all the way through. Take care of yourself and take care of each other.